I wanted to thank you for participating in this graduate research project. Today we'll be looking at blackwater rivers and floodplain forests, and specifically we'll be concentrating on the Hillsborough River in Tampa, Florida. This is a blackwater river. The water moves very slowly through very heavily forested areas. As the water is in contact with vegetation, it picks up material, becomes tea-stained in color, and this is an aerial shot of the Hillsborough River. You notice in the bottom third the course of the river winding through the forested habitat. The river itself looks like this as you're sitting in a boat kind of looking across the forested area. The water itself is dark. The forest moves right up to the edge of the banks. And these questions are put in here to make you think about features. So as we look at this river, you can notice that the vegetation crowds out the bank structure. Now, a question to look at is this narration useful throughout the video? Should it stop and go based on the need for that, or should this be a text-based activity? As you're looking at this particular section of the Hillsborough River, is it useful to have any text here or talking about this, or would it be useful just to look? Blackwater rivers are wetland systems. All wetlands have three characteristics: water present at the surface or near it, plants that like water, and soils that have lots of water in there and pushing out the oxygen. And in this case, the first feature, water. You can actually see this is a photo from the Hillsborough River. The water is kind of dark. In this area here, you can see the water between the cypress trees. This water is very still on the surface, but it is slowly moving through the system. In this case, you don't really see much water, but if you look at the trees, you'll see the water goes much higher during floods. In this case, we're looking at the banks. You see some cypress knees, but there's also cormorant in there, a bird very closely associated with water as they fish the system. Now, in many cases, we don't have to see the water. We can look at the evidence on trees. In this case, it's almost like the ring in a bathtub. We see watermarks on the cypress knees and the trees themselves. Now, once again, those questions are directing your attention. Is it useful to have text? In this case, you see a picture pointing out those watermarks. Is this helpful? Is the still working with the videos a useful feature? Wetlands have a very characteristic soil called a histosol. Histosols contain lots of organic material that is undecayed at the top. There's no oxygen in the soil, so things can't break down. In this next slide, you'll see the very dark upper layers, and that's where the organics are preserved by the qualities that are there and not having oxygen. 36% of the soil can actually be organic, and in some cases, as you notice in the slide, there's actually things called peat or muck fires where they start on fire. Lots of open space in cypress domes. There is shading, so the vegetation is not going to have a big chance to get the sunlight. When we look at this next slide, the thing we would look at in a wetlands is there anything stopping you from moving about? This is the open floor structure of a typical swamp habitat. We look at the idea that certain plants are associated with wetlands. We talked about the fact that there's water. We talk about soil, but plants are one of the biggest indicators. In this case, here's a cypress dome. And we talk about this. Cypress domes are strongly associated with wetlands in the southern states. Cypress trees have very characteristic leaf structures. The idea, of course, is these leaves are very feathery. They have cones. They are a conifer, so they're going to retain their cones up in the system. They're very small. And when you see cypress trees, we usually see them in the riverbank structure. As you see from the next few slides, the trees are right actually in the water. They're able to survive immersion. The cypress wood is very resistant to breaking down, one of the reasons why it's desired. But other plants are associated with wetlands. Elodea, as you notice, this plant actually is kind of something that's commonly found in aquarium stores, but it's a long linear structure. Now, what do you want to know about these plants? If we're showing you videos and talking about them, what are the things that might be useful? Is text useful? Is this conversation useful? For example, this is fragrant water lily, large white flower, yellow center, large leaves. But you notice in this slide we put in pickerweed. You should notice the actual flower structure and leaf shape. Duck potato, now very similar to the last one. What kind of information would be useful? In this case, notice that the leaves are much more narrow. The flowers are white. The stalks of the leaves are actually very long. So do you want these features, when we talk about these virtual field trips, to talk or write? Should they be text within the system itself? Very pretty species in here usually has a yellow flower, but one of the characteristics is very large leaf structures. Canna is. Bracken fern. This actually grows up the trunk of trees. It's not in the water, but it grows in the wetter areas of those things and also found in vegetation. Curly dock. Now you notice there's some text in here. Is it easy to see, hard to see? These species, should the slide have the name? Should it be before or after? In this case, you're going to see the name before and then the actual plant. Now, this can go at any speed because it can be controlled. So for a burr sedge, we could stop this And also stop it when the picture comes up and point the relevant characteristics out. So what's useful? Pitcher plants are carnivorous plants, an insect eater. They lure flowers in and they fall down inside. They act as a type of fertilizer. And you can see them. They have a very distinctive shape. Skullcap, which is a lobelia, very beautiful species. Bell-like flowers hanging down. We also look at some of the animal species. Here's a brown water snake. Closely resembles the water moccasin. What would you want to know? Well, you'd have to look at the head structure. Notice the head here is very rounded. But in the water moccasin, very distinctive triangular head with a dark stripe alternating with a white stripe. So the question I would ask you is, how can you tell the difference? These are important questions. What are the features you need to have? Do you see the features, or does the instructor, for example, with the great horned owl, what features do you see? What things would you need to tell it apart from, let's say, the barred owl? The barred owl, one of the most common features is the facial disc, a very round circle with very dark eyes. Hawks, red-shouldered hawk, and the name tells you everything. If you look in the picture, there's a lot of red. Other hawks don't have this color structure. The possum, a very common mammal, one of the only North American marsupials. But you see them commonly, though, not in places associated with habitats, but in your backyard because they are opportunistic. Black vultures are a very important species for scavenging dead carcasses. Wild turkeys, very, very common in many of the forested wetlands habitats, are able to survive quite well there. The ubiquitous 9-banded armadillo, which is found pretty much everywhere in Florida, and you can see that it's a very familiar species. Wood storks, if you look at the head structure, you notice there's no feathers on the head. That's a very common characteristic. But is this useful to have narration on these material, or is it something you'd like to figure out? Eastern white-tailed deer, you actually see a very classic picture of them standing together, both a buck and a doe. Now, as you're looking at all of this, what I want you to do is think about the features just seen, and then provide this information back.